My goal is to help you improve movement, your lifestyle, training, your endurance, get you out of pain so you can enjoy the time you spend on the things that you love to do. Phil here with Acu-Fit.com, Acu-Fit Inc. on my social media. Today we want to talk about some keys when it comes to our surfing and the ability to have mobile and strong hips. In my acupuncture clinic, as well as in the gym setting, I see a lot of people coming off a history of desk work, being behind a desk, working behind a desk in a sedentary lifestyle, and for them to get into another workout routine or wanting to get back to a sport that they used to perform and love but can't because they've got knee pain, if they got back pain or shoulder pain. We want to make sure that we are moving efficiently from the start before getting into any dynamic expressions of exercise and fitness. You'll see a lot of times on social media, which a lot of the exercises are great, but they're more from a dynamic and advanced place where most of the people that I see are not at yet. So we don't want to get there and try to injure ourselves or get discouraged by the fact that we can't do certain things. A lot of times it's because of our foundation isn't quite up to speed yet. So let's get up to speed by following these keys to improving your sport. It is very important that this ball and socket joint of ours in the hip has access to good mobility, because when we're in a stance, a surf stance or an athletic stance that requires hip mobility and a pelvic rotation, we need to have the ability to perform that, not only in flexion when it comes to a surf stance, being able to flex down and extend through the legs. We want to be able to rotate in the pelvis, and at the same time we're rotating on a fixed upper leg and femur. And at the same time, when we're in this stance, if we don't have the good internal rotation of the hip, it's going to put undue stress on the inside of that back knee when it comes to surfing. So to begin with, we want to start with an exercise what we call a 90-90 or a bretzel. So to be biomechanically efficient, we need to be sure that we need to be able to get into these hip movements and not put undue stress on the knee that's not biomechanically mobile. Okay? The knee is more of a stable joint, so we want to get access to better mobility in those hips. To start with, we want to begin by putting ourselves in this 90-90 position. All right? From here, you can see from either side, 90 degrees, and being able to hold this position with a tall neutral spine or a nice straight flat back. As you can see, there is some abduction of this back hip and internal rotation as well as external rotation of that front hip to be able to move. And before we can get into a lot of the dynamics of it and moving more freely and efficiently, we need to be able to get the mobility in those hip joints. And if we're unable to get into this position, then we need to modify or regress the posture so we can slowly move into more dynamic and better flexibility, because we don't want to move so much from the upper back and torso when it comes to these types of stretches and movements. We want to have better access to the mobility of the ball and socket of the hips. So what we first want to do is get access to that rotation and the mobility in the hips. We want to be able to start from a very basic position. Can you get into this 90-degree angle, maintaining a nice, tall, straight posture? Because there's external rotation of this front hip and internal rotation and abduction of that back hip. If we don't have a good external rotation of that lead leg, we're going to get into this forward posture, bending from the lower back and the mid back, just to get ourselves in proper position. So what we need to work on is elevating those hips a little bit so we can get into a better 90-degree position and not bending from the lower back, but getting better at hip mobility. So before getting into any dynamic type movement of the hips, we want to make sure that we can maintain that neutral spine nice and straight through the back without getting into some wonky bending of the body and torso, because we're not quite at that level of hip flexibility yet. So what you can start with is by using a pillow to sit on, a yoga block, something of that nature. What I've got here is a dino pillow, and you can put yourself much easier in this position of 90 degrees with a nice neutral spine, and then work your way into the hip mobility and stretch. All right, by focusing on straight posture, good neutral spine, nice and tall through the chest, and then hinging from the hip. So not only do we want to be able to get comfortable in this 90-degree position with a nice straight back, neutral spine, but the external rotation of the lead leg, but the internal rotation of the back leg when it comes to our surfing. Being that I'm regular footed, my left leg is my back trail leg, so the internal rotation is important. So if you can start to practice rotating the chest and the torso toward that back leg to improve the internal rotation of that leg, it'll be much more efficient, and you'll be able to master these basics before getting into any more dynamic or loaded movements, so we can slowly build on progress and prevent injury. So now adductors, groin muscles, we want to be able to have free range of motion when it comes to our hip mobility. So for starters, we're going to begin with a half kneeling position. Here's a full kneeling position, half kneeling position. The foot is in line with the knee. We're going to brace the inside of that lead leg with the hand to maintain an open hip as we lunge to the side and stretch, maintain contact with the heel on the floor. The torso is nice and tall. We don't get wonky through the torso, slumping the shoulders, rounding from the middle back, or turning towards the leg. We want to stay open, so we stretch that inner thigh and groin as well. You may feel some inner thigh and groin adductor muscles stretch on this side, as well as the hip abduction and mobility on the kneeling side. And switching, remember, the foot is in line with the knee. We brace that lead leg to help keep that hip open to get the most out of that groin stretch as we come to the side. Next is your hip flexor stretch. We want to make sure that we can get good hip mobility from the front aspect of the thigh hip flexor, so as musculature, even some of the TFL, little small pocket muscle. If you think about how your slacks, your hand fits in your pocket of your slacks, that's where your TFL will lie. A lot of times you'll see a lot of this overextension through the back. If your hip flexors are tight, they're naturally going to create a shortening in the thigh. Again, getting back to those that work at a desk for a long period of time, have a history of being at a desk, those hip flexors and those muscles have a tendency to get shortened and tight. So when we go into this, it turns out to be a lot of lumbar curvature. We want to prevent that. So we want to create a little bit better understanding of the pelvis and how it tilts. We want to create a posterior pelvic tilt. So if you think about how a dog tucks its tail, and we want to squeeze that buttocks, and just that in itself will create just enough stretch to satisfy the need of stretching those quads and the hip flexor. Anterior tilt is going to be more where, let's say for example, you're pouring water out the front, where you're getting this shortened hip flexor and a lot of extension through your lower back. So we want to make sure we stay neutral, squeeze that glute, shoulder on top of the hip over the knee, or the rib cage over the hip, and then over the knee as we stretch. If you want to get a little deeper into that stretch, we can raise the arm up, and we can do a little side bend like a Samson stretch. As we stretch, get a little bit further up into that abdomen and psoas area. We can do clock rotation, so we can get a little bit more dynamic with it, and forward, and then to the other side as we rotate back and stretch. So here's an advanced version of the half kneeling hip flexor stretch. We want to be sure that we are maintaining that posterior pelvic tilt. Nice drawn in abdomens, nice and tall, and make sure you're breathing. This is just going to give you that much deeper of a stretch. Not everyone is going to be able to have that knee flexion here. If not, always start back from the beginning and slowly progress to this. This isn't necessarily something that you'll be able to do at the beach before surfing with the ball, but all the same, this is just a little advanced version. You can go into some rotations or some advanced stretches by reaching and doing a side bend to get a little deeper. We can brace that front knee, get into some rotations on either side, again bracing the outside of the knee. So there you have it, 3 fundamental stretches to isolate the tissues of the hip to improve your mobility. Always remember to start with the basics, breathe throughout each stretch to improve the mobility of the joint before getting into some higher intensity, progressive, dynamic movements. I'm Phil Gallo. Follow along at Acu-Fit.com or on my social media at Acu-Fit Inc. Take care. We'll see you next time.